Hey guys, this is going to be really about the next few looms will be about the commercial revolution. This is the outcome of the age of discovery and how it had both global and European impact. We will see it is the development, the birth of what I call modern economics. Remember, guys, we're giving birth to the modern era. The Renaissance was a cultural, intellectual movement that gave birth to the modern era. And the discovery period, the age of discovery for Europe, will add on. This is the birth of modern globalism. And once again, it's going to be extraordinarily Eurocentric. And this is just where we've been already. We've already discussed the idea of in the summer assignments, feudalism and manorialism, just the idea how the nobility had a whole bunch of power over the fief. Well, remember, there is no real trade there. The kings were looking to undermine the nobility, and merchants were seeking new freedoms. Remember, they want to redefine that word usury, if you remember that. We've already discussed that. And that's where we look at. Well, remember, guys, with the Renaissance, this is the first page of the Northern economic recovery. After the Crusades, the Europeans realized they wanted to connect to Constantinople. They wanted to trade. They wanted the silk, spices, porcelain. They wanted new ideas from the Arabs and the Africans. So that's why we talked about the formation of Hansa. Remember, we talked about the formation of Hansa as they developed trade fairs to attract the Venetian Flanders fleet. And we talked about how that really gave birth to that modern economy. We talked about how the new industries and entrepreneurs really developed. We went from textile to metallurgy to others. And then we talked about the birth of the banking with the Medici, the single family. So those were the things that we see this European recovery. Well, that's going to lead us straight to this price revolution. This is the first big thing. Look at your power maps right now. If you don't have the price revolution at a P2 level, if it's just kind of a random detail in an ocean of words, what you're doing, you're outlining. Dr. Spivogel clearly put the price revolution in bold, and this is really one of the three important aspects of this power map. That price revolution is really going to transition into this thing that we know, modern economy. Again, the economy, that's not a big deal, but the price revolution. The price revolution was a time period in the 16th century where there was rapid inflation. Now, I want to make sure you understand inflation is caused by the devaluing of coins. When you devalue money, prices rise. That's typically what drives inflation. We can also talk about and inflation is the increase in prices, but there's also a demand issue that we can talk about. So now, is it a coin issue or is it a demand issue? And this is where Dr. Spivogel does something, and he weighs the two ideas. And this is where you can develop historical based arguments. What is the most important? Is it about the great gold influx, the influx of bullion from the Americas that fattened up the economy? There was more gold bullion than ever before in European history there. And of course, that devalued the coins. If you devalue the coins, that will increase prices. Well, that's your orthodox, your traditional view on what caused it. Well, Dr. Spivogel also talked about something different. He talked about the idea of a population expansion. During the 16th century, thanks to the Columbian Exchange, which I hope you've already read about, the Columbian Exchange, there was this new rapid connection or new food access, potatoes, tomatoes, and others. What began to happen is you begin to see a drastic population increase with these new foods. Well, if you have a higher population, what happens to demand? Of course, demand goes up. And once that demand goes up, that creates higher prices. Well, this is the two things that are weighed together. Is it the gold or is it demand? Dr. Spivogel, I believe, believes it was the population expansion. And that appears to be what most historians agreed with. But I want to point out the influx of gold did have a contribution. It just means that the population expansion might be the most important. Well, why is this important, right? I want to point out that for our class, I want to point out that it's the merchants. The merchants have they have access to large sums of capital. They are waiting for a moment to invest. And as the merchants accumulate capital, this is going to begin to fund the rest of the modern history. So I do think it's important. We can talk about nobles, of course. We can talk about the plight of the peasants. But for our conversation, I do believe the price revolution helps transition us into the modern era as the merchants begin to access more capital and they begin to invest. And I promise you, the next three things are part of it. Now, with that, let's look at the slide. I love this slide. This is actually what AP test questions look like. They'll give you a graphic, an image, or a quote, and they'll have 3 to 4 questions. And what I want to point out, look right here. This is in England, the price revolution in England, and it's tracing the development of the economics for 200 years. Think about it right here. At this moment, grain, livestock, wood, manufactured goods, all of those guys, wages equaled what they could buy. But look what happens around 1510. We begin to see grain expand. And this is why Dr. Spivogel talks about the importance of population. There's a growing demand for grain. And then look, livestock. These are price of woods, but look what has happened to wages. Are these guys able to buy more or less? Of course, they're buying less, which means their standard of living or the way they live is destroyed. That's what the price revolution is. It's absolutely horrible for the poor, but in the end, it benefits overall because of the expansion. And that's what we got. Now, with that said, let's talk about the birth of capitalism. The birth of capitalism, and again, this is going to be a Dutch phenomenon, which is the key city will be Amsterdam, and it's going to be in what we know as the Netherlands. You've already located the Netherlands before on your summer assignment. If you haven't, that's your fault, not mine. But this is going to be a Dutch phenomenon. Before we move on, I'm going to circle this, capitalism. According to capitalism, government should be less involved in the economy. Capitalism is all about merchants. They want less government involved. Think about that. Think about the idea of the merchants, or what's a cool word for merchants? Burgers. And we're going to talk about the story of the birth of commercial capitalism. I do believe a lot of this stuff is kind of lost in the reading, and I'm going to help you guys understand it. So again, this actually might be the most important of the entire lesson, which is the actual most important lesson of the entire unit. All right, joint stock company. Again, you guys can define joint stock company. Joint stock company is when a small group of merchants come together and share economic risk. Well, when they're able to share the economic risk, well, that allows for more advancement of infrastructure. I'm less worried about failure because I'm only using a part of my wealth. That's really important. So it's about shared risk. Well, if I'm able to share the risk, I'm able to take bigger risks. Okay. And if you don't know, anytime you invest in a business, it's a big risk. If I invest all of my money in one business and that goes bankrupt, what happens to my wealth? Of course, it's gone. But what happens if I only invest 10% of my wealth? Sucks I've lost 10%, but I still have 90%. That's what we're looking at. The most successful joint stock company is the Dutch East India Company. If you look at all these images, this map is a wonderful map that illustrates all of the connectivity of the East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was based in Amsterdam, The goals were to dominate the spice and slave trade. We've talked about that already. We talk about the success, significant profits. Those profits are going to turn into capital. And Amsterdam will have the most capital ever in history at this moment. So much profit. We talk about Batavia. Remember Batavia? We've already seen the image of that. You should already understand that. And the importance. So the Dutch East India Company was able to make so much profit that Amsterdam was saturated. When I mean saturated, that means there's so much wealth that they've already maximized their investment in the Dutch East India Company. So if you've maximized your investment, you're no longer investing in that company. Since you're no longer investing in that company, you now have accumulated bullion. And now the question is, what is next? So because of the success of the Dutch East India Company, Amsterdam becomes the commercial center of the world. As there's so much bullion, they begin to think about what they're going to invest in next. And this is the immediate outcome, right? And what happens is the Dutch burghers and artisans who now have accumulated tons of bullion, right? Individually, just pounds, right? But overall tons. They begin to think, what do we do with that? Well, as the Fuggers, as you read, collapsed, the Bank of Amsterdam develops. And the Bank of Amsterdam is when you have a group of merchants and stuff, and they deposit their money into the bank. So the Bank of Amsterdam now has collected deposits from, let's say, 1,000 people. Well, 1,000 people might only put $10 in, but what's $10 times 10,000? You can do the math, and all of a sudden we see it's tons of money. And so the Bank of Amsterdam begins to control a large amount of capital. Well, what do banks do? Banks make loans. And they're going to make safe loans because again, they're going to make safe loans, and safe loans are almost guaranteed. If I know Bob comes up to me and say, I want to make a widget, and I see that these widgets are going to be really demanded, they're really important, what I'm going to do is I'm going to loan him that money. He's going to pay me once he starts selling his goods, he's going to pay that loan back with interests. That's what we do. And then who benefits? It's going to be the depositors. Because if I deposit $10, I might want $100 in 10 years from it. I want to accumulate that interest as a depositor. So that's what happens. The Bank of Amsterdam begins to oversee the economy, and they begin to make safe loans. Industries that they feel very confident will be successful, they loan them the money. And then as those artisans begin to build infrastructure and make money, they pay their loans back with interest. That's how our economy does it. It's being born at this moment. This is why I do think this is the birth of the modern world. So you have an expansion of infrastructure. I like this little image. I've actually stood right in this little area in Amsterdam. If you ever get a chance, Amsterdam is my favorite city, I think, in Europe. As of right now, there's a couple other cities I'm going to, but that's another story. But that's what we look at. And the bank helps organize the economy, begins to develop safe loans, moderate loans. They begin to see the expansion of industry. Well, this leads us to the final part of capitalism, the Bourse. The Amsterdam Bourse is the stock exchange. And I want to point out there's so much capital. There is a group of burghers, these Bill Gates of the era, if you will. They literally have tons of bullion. They're so wealthy that they begin to say, I bet you we're going to be able to make even bigger risks. And these risks, somebody might come up and say, I think that this widget is something that's demanded. I bet you if I invent this, I bet you people will want to buy it. Well, these burgers are like, maybe it's true. So what they're willing to do is buy. They're willing to buy shares in their stock. So artisans who had radical, risky ideas went to the burgers, and that they're going to be in this area here. And those burgers are just chilling out. And the artisans go, hey, do you want to buy a share of my company? So what these burgers do, they listen and they go, all right, what is it that you're trying to sell? And the artisans say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to make this, and I think it's going to be demanded. If a group of merchants said, oh, I think that's cool, what they will do, they will buy shares. The investment becomes shares or stocks in the company. And all of a sudden, these these artisans have now access to capital, and they try their hardest to invent what they're trying to invent. What happens if they fail? The burgers, those wealthiest burgers, are like, it is what it is. If I have £1 billion and I gave you 100 pounds, 100 pounds of gold, I lost it, but I still got £1 billion. Not that worried, right? But what happens if you're successful? If you're successful, you're going to have even more advanced infrastructure. That's really important because you begin to see the advancement. So let's review. The Dutch East India Company initiates this entire economic revolution where they have so much bullion that they have to formulate the Amsterdam Bank of Amsterdam. They're going to reorganize their economy. And then even more investments will occur with the Bourse. In today's world, where's the Amsterdam Bourse similar to? Of course, it's Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange. That is going to be because we borrow heavily. And again, as a Gen Xer, I will tell you, I do think capitalism is a wonderful economic system that creates opportunities and advances technology. But I also know some of my friends who are millennials, they see it a little differently. We could definitely have that conversation later. But at this moment, I want to point out the Amsterdam Bourse, the Dutch East India Company, Bank of Amsterdam, and Amsterdam Bourse transforms the economy. So commercial capitalism, who's in charge? Of course, it's the merchants. The government isn't even in the conversation. I haven't talked about a king. I haven't talked about princes. And what happens is with all of this risk, we begin to see the most advanced modern infrastructure. A little bit later, we're going to talk about the dikes that they built, which are big seawalls. We're going to talk about the different businesses. And eventually, this is going to transform to the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. And that's where we got it. I hope that makes sense. Let me go ahead and finish up with mercantilism as we speak. Mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic philosophy that says there's a limited amount of wealth. All of their wealth is based on bullion. Bullion is precious metals, gold, silver, etc. The country that has the trade policies that maximize their bullion, they gain the most bullion, they become the most powerful. In this, they want to develop a fair balance of trade. I'm not going to talk much about subsidies, but I want to define tariffs. A favorable balance of trade is when you export more than you import. You sell more than you buy. This seems like something you would want to learn as an individual, right? Your house most likely operates with a mercantile mindset. Whatever money your parents make, they don't want to overspend. That's how a country does it. And at this moment, these countries are based on a really concrete, finite concept of gold here. But they want to export more than you import. So therefore, they don't want their people to buy foreign goods. So if I'm in England, if I'm the king of England, who do I want the English to buy from? The French or the English? Of course, I want them to buy from the English. Because if they buy products from France, what do we lose? Bullion. We don't want to do that. So what the king will do is set up tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on imports. So if the king of England sets up a series of if the king wants to limit the people from buying French goods, you set taxes on the imports or tariffs, and that raises the prices. So therefore, what products will they buy? Of course, domestic British products. That's the purpose. They want to make sure that they hold on to their what B word? Bullion. And I hope you're doing it like I showed you in class. Grab that bull by the horns and go, bullion. And that's where we got it. And I'm not going to get this in great detail. I think the textbook does a good job. Because wealth is all based on this finite amount of gold, what we're going to see is the Dutch the English and the French are going to have a series of wars because they're fighting not just for colonies, they're fighting for wealth. Now, with that said, I love these images, and I'm going to do it one at a time. This is what mercantilism wants. They want their mother country's treasury to have a ton of bullion. The only way they're going to be able to do that is by establishing a favorable balance of trade. They want more exports than imports, sell more than they buy. If they do that, that means they will have a positive, they'll be in the black. And if they're in the black, that means they're making more and more and more bullion. So what do they then do? They say, hey, we want cheap raw materials and more markets. Well, that leads us to mercantilism in practice. Mercantile countries create colonies for two reasons. They want cheap raw materials, such as gold, silver, fur, timber, and foodstuffs. That says lumber, but timber, sorry. And they want the colonies to serve as their markets to buy their manufactured goods. So what we see here is the mother country looking to expand their favorable balance of trade, which then will impact their treasury. They want to sell more domestic products. And what do? They develop colonies, such as the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies send raw materials to Mother England. We can talk about sugar, tobacco, etc., whatever you want to talk about. And then once the mother country then develops them into manufactured goods, they send them back to the 13 colonies for markets. And then the 13 colonies will buy the products. Bullion will go this way. They sell more. Boom. So who always benefits? The mother country. And that's the purpose of a mercantile colony. And again, I really like that. If you're a little confused, stay with me. Again, your textbook talks about this. Mother country wants to be self-sufficient. They do not want to rely on other countries. And look what we see. Mother country selling manufactured goods for that. And I like that image as well. And again, we see the Navigation Acts as an example. Navigation Acts, England, Mother England, wanted to control the colonies, and they wanted a circular trade. Mother England wanted to benefit from their colonies. So they passed the Navigation Acts and said, colonies, you can only buy and sell from us. Screw the Dutch, screw the Spanish. Now let's look at the conclusion. The price revolution transformed the European economy. We see the commercial capitalism flourish in the Netherlands as the burghers sought new opportunities in the Bank of Amsterdam and the Bourse. And we see mercantilism emerged as being the focal point for centralizing nation states. The focus of bullion and a nation's physical wealth impacted diplomacy and imperialism. I hope that makes sense. If you have more questions, I will definitely be happy to answer it later.